apart impossible tender moments of time, shipping vessels of history, ancient history, destroying the fabric, the godlike claw of destiny of a people with a gun, a knife, a cannon, building the hideous wall of blood called slavery.
Morning, as described in Black Agenda Report from December 9th to the 13th, 240 delegates came from 30 nations from 4 continents, and they gathered for the international conference entitled Cuba 2024 Decade for People of African Descent, Equality, Equity, and Social Justice. It took place in the cities of Havana and Matanzas, Cuba. Why won't the U.S. government remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terror, allowing the country to grow, thrive, and prosper? And also, the Sahel region of the African continent. What is the alliance of Sahel states, and why is it important? Hey, let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view events, current events, as though they happen in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and their broader historic context, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that impact the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issues before us are Cuba and the Sahel. My guest is the president and co-founder of the Thomas Sankara Centre for African Liberation and Unity, which is a Pan-African library and political education center based in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. And I hope I got somewhere close to that proper pronunciation, where she lives. She's also working to open up a second Thomas Sankara Centre in Niger. And she's a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and a journalist with Africa Stream. Inem Richardson, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm so excited to exchange with you and get to share more about my experiences, both in Cuba and in the Sahel where I live.
Thank you. Let's first start with you being the president and co-founder of the Thomas Sankara Centre for African Liberation and Unity. Explain the significance of Thomas Sankara and why this Center for African Liberation and Unity.
Okay, well, the first thing to understand is that Thomas Sankara was a revolutionary Pan-African and socialist leader who served as the president of Burkina Faso from 1983 to 1987. And while it was a very brief period of time within the country's overall history, it was the most transformative period in pretty much the establishment of Burkina Faso's national identity. Before, the country was actually known as Upper Volta. It changed the name, but not just the name, the entire value system and, principles by which people live in the country. It was a revolution that was modeled in many ways off of the Cuban Revolution. The slogans of both the Cuban Revolution and the Burkina Faso Revolution are actually the same. The homeland or death, we will succeed. And during that period of time, there were various campaigns such as literacy campaigns, public health campaigns, campaigns for the liberation of women to elevate women to more positions of power in the country. This was a time when workers and farmers were really empowered to make changes in this West African country. And today, Thomas Sankara is a significant figure, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the region, and I would say, even across the continent, somebody that young people are turning to as a model of inspiration and as an example of the kind of political future that they want. At the Thomas Sankara Centre, we are a political education center and a Pan-African library, like you explained. We model ourselves based off of the ideology of Thomas Sankara, and we help the community to have access to the transcribed speeches of Thomas Sankara, as well as other Pan-African books. For example, books written by people like Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, who was also a Pan-Africanist, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Malcolm X, Assata Shakur. So, if you're familiar with these figures, you might have an idea. We bring works, the translations of their works into French, which is the language spoken, make them publicly available to the community who can come and check them out. We have a Young Pioneer program that was modeled after the one that was created during the Thomas Sankara Revolution of the 80s, where we teach the children, mostly between the ages of 18 to 14, about African history, Pan-African struggle. We teach them about things like, what is colonialism? What is imperialism? How do we understand and struggle against these things? What are the resources that are found in Africa? And where do those resources go? These are the conversations we have with children. And then with adults, we have workshops, film screenings. We have a work study circle that meets every week. We're currently reading a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which was written by Walter Rodney, and we're studying that collectively. So we're really doing the work of diffusing this sort of Pan-African political education in the community. And unfortunately, some people might be surprised to hear that, even though Burkina Faso has a revolutionary history, and I would argue even a very revolutionary present, and I hopefully we'll get to that.
Absolutely.
It's really hard to find those materials. Yeah. Unfortunately, like the actual resources to understand these things, just books themselves that are about Africa, they're very hard to come across. So we're trying to fill that gap and make those available to the community for free.
As you and I were discussing yesterday, I just want to reiterate this point. Books. I was telling you that on my Sirius XM show that sometimes listeners will call in and say, Dr. Leon, you talk all this stuff, you tell us all these things. What are we to do? Tell us what to do. And the first thing I say to them is, well, you need to read. You need to read, because once you start reading, you can take control of your living room. And then after you take control of your living room, you can go and take control of your front yard. And then after you take control of your front yard, you can take control of your block. And then from your block, you can take control of your neighborhood. And they in many instances, people, man, read. What are you talking about? So you have the Thomas Sankara Centre, and one of the elements is a Pan-African library. And you just talked about you are helping people to get a better understanding of imperialism, which I would then think you're talking about anti-imperialism, and colonialism, then neocolonialism and anti-neocolonialism, which are having a dramatic impact on the current on-the-ground reality in Burkina Faso. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, reading is so important. Thomas Sankara himself had a quote that said that a soldier without political and ideological education was a potential criminal, because in his experience, He recalled himself being somebody who came through the military, meeting soldiers who, when they're told to go and fight or shoot somewhere, they will. But we need to actually understand what we're doing. And it's not just for soldiers, it's for doctors, it's for, teachers, educators, it's for gardeners, farmers, it's for the entire society. We need to understand, the work we do, who it benefits, and be able to make sure that the work is contributing to society at large, and not just, lining the pockets of, somebody who's over at the top, not necessarily benefiting the community. And it really does start with reading. There's, I think, especially now, a war for our attention, and it's harder and harder because there's so much scrolling, there's so much distraction. I'm not against it because it can be a tool to, be able to speak on social media and diffuse things, but you have to be able to sit down and develop the discipline to read and to learn and to further your curiosity. And especially in a place like Burkina Faso today, it's so important because people are really fired up, engaged in anti-imperialist struggle, engaged in Pan-African struggle, understanding that, the future of Africa is really in the hands of this new generation that is learning from this historical precedent and is trying to do the work of studying what came before them so that they can shape a new future, like you said, that is anti-neocolonialist.
And before we get to the Cuba conference, and one more point, and I want to shift gears quickly just to Venezuela and use Venezuela as an example, because we hear in the West all the time this anti-Nicolas Maduro narrative. And for those who don't know, Maduro is the president of Venezuela. And we keep hearing anti-Maduro, anti-Maduro, anti-Maduro. But what gets lost in all of this is it's not about Nicolas Maduro. He is merely, as far as the Venezuelan people are concerned, he is an instrument of the revolution. And as long as he adheres to the tenets of the revolution, he will stay and retain favor with the people of Venezuela. If he were to deviate from the tenets of the revolution, he would be overthrown immediately. And I use that as an example of it's about the ideology of the revolution that matters to the people of Burkina Faso, to the people of other Sahel states, for example, to the people of Venezuela. The United States loves to make it about the individual, losing sight of the broader context of the revolution.
Absolutely. This is a really important point. I don't know how many people across the United States as a whole even realize that there is a revolution that is happening in 3 countries in Africa that are, all bordering each other, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. But it's very important to understand that what is happening there is a revolutionary process, and it's not just about the individuals. I think some people get worried because they see there were coups, and that's kind of how the Western media portrays it. Like these countries have gone rogue and there's all these coup governments and the military is taking over. I think we should remember Thomas Sankara himself actually was somebody who came through the military, and he did take power in that way. But that revolution is called the Popular and Democratic Revolution because the power was in the hands of the people. And it's surprising to a lot of people to understand that democracy may not just be about, going out to vote every 4 years, but there's other forms of democracy that people are developing. They're experimenting with these new forms. With the Alliance of Sahel states, these 3 countries in Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, are about. The people are so empowered to make change. I mean, to give you one example of what it's like in Burkina Faso, where I live, we have something called the Citizens Night Watch, which serves as the eyes and ears of the revolution. This is a popular network of civilians. They formed it themselves, a grassroots initiative that exists all across the country. In the capital where I live, in Ouagadougou, they organize in every single roundabout. In the US, roundabouts aren't really super common, but just think about it as every single popular intersection or street corner in the city, all across the city. They're out from 9 p.m. to around 4 or 5 a.m. every single night. They do this in every single major city in the country, every single roundabout or city And then in 2,000 villages across the country, this is how people are organizing to defend and protect the revolution. They are working to defend and protect Ibrahim Traoré, the president, not just because he's the president. I mean, they didn't do this for other presidents. They're doing it because he listens to their cries, he's following their interests. Every single major policy decision that's come out of the Alliance of Sahel states so far has been something that the people of the three countries have asked for. They didn't want to continue military collaboration with France, so the French military occupation in the country was expelled from all three countries. You know, they wanted to see more industrial development, they wanted to see more farming technology, and so the countries of those three states started partnering with countries that are not in this sort of imperialist camp, but countries that are willing to give more technology transfers to develop that. The people have asked for Pan-African unity, so the governments of the three countries are working to actually eradicate the internal borders between those three states, which is a huge deal. They are pretty much doing everything as a bloc, as a unit, and working towards this idea of a Pan-African federation, much like, you know, Marcus Garvey talked about the United States of Africa. Kwame Nkrumah talked about, you know, this Africa must unite. They're working in this sort of pathway to unify all three countries. These are demands from the people. So it's, you know, the leadership's important. We're happy we have Africa's youngest president, you know, one of the world's youngest presidents. If he's not number one, he's the second youngest, then one of the two, who came to power just at the age of 34. He relates to the people. We're happy. He's charismatic. He's honest. He gives speeches that are, you know, about U.S. imperialism and French imperialism, which are not things that most African leaders, unfortunately, are willing to talk about. He is. So we admire him a lot, but it isn't just about him as an individual. It really is about the fact that the people who are very well organized are presenting their demands, and that these demands are being taken up and adopted and becoming policy. And so people have, you know, even more important than, you know, a 4-year president vote, they're able to actually decide what's happening from one day to the next in terms of the direction of the country.
And again, I promise we are going to get to the Cuba conversation, but I think that, again, the show is connecting the dots, and it's important, I believe, for the audience to understand the interrelatedness between these countries. And I go back to Venezuela. And what brought this to mind was you're talking about the citizens groups that protect the roundabouts. Well, there are similar groups in Venezuela. The Venezuelan government has armed the citizenry. Now, why would a government feel comfortable arming the citizenry unless the government was confident that it was doing the work of the citizens, or else the citizens would turn their arms on the government? One of the reasons why the United States can't just go and invade Venezuela is because the people are armed to protect their country. An example of that, about 2 years ago or so, the United States CIA and some other international entities sent a group to try to overthrow Maduro. That group was trying to get to the country via boat. They were captured by Venezuelan fishermen, and they were exposed for the plot that they were there to impose or to employ. And many people call it the Bay of Piglets. Because these U.S. military operatives were there to try to overthrow, and they failed because they were captured by the citizens of Venezuela who were there to protect their government. Just throwing that out there as an example of, again, what. And here's the thing: why would so many governments be opposed to a government exercising sovereignty, educating its people, improving healthcare, improving the quality of agriculture? Why would a government like the United States be opposed to a government in Burkina Faso trying to improve the quality of life for its citizens?
That's a really important question. And your point about Venezuela, I think, is super pertinent here. Is like in Burkina Faso, things are very similar. I think another comparison to the situation in Burkina Faso that might be helpful to understand things is if people understand maybe the history of Nicaragua and other countries in Central America where the United States backed death squads that terrorized people for a very long time. I think there's an important parallel in terms of some of what imperialist strategy looks like in Burkina Faso right now. In Burkina Faso, if you Google the country and you read the news, you'll see headlines about violent terrorist attacks, warfare in the country. And the way people on the ground understand what's happening is they understand that imperialist forces are backing what are essentially death squads, and these death squads have been used as a pretext to justify Western military intervention for a long time in the region. The U.S. military AFRICOM, that's what they call their command and their military presence in Africa, use Niger as its primary base in the western half of Africa for the longest time. Niger actually was the site of the U.S. Air Force's largest construction project in history, and the largest U.S. drone base in Africa was in Niger up until the current revolutionary government of Niger kicked them out. But there's this struggle against what is framed as terrorism. But if you actually look at what the leaders of the Sahel have put out, in 2022, Mali actually went to the UN General Assembly and stated that France was arming and providing intelligence to these terrorist organizations. So that was what Mali very publicly put forward. Mm-hmm. And then since that time, all three of the countries have also accused Ukraine of doing similar work, because unfortunately, two Ukrainian officials, one of them who's involved in Ukraine's defense based in Ukraine, and the other one is actually a local ambassador in West Africa based in Senegal, publicly admitted to basically supporting a terrorist organization up in northern Mali. They celebrated actually a terrorist attack. And after that, the three countries also, took this situation to the UN to say that, Ukraine is publicly pretty much admitting to supporting terrorism. The United States is, hasn't been as blatantly accused, but in popular conception, the way people understand these terrorist organizations is that they're backed by, the West and, this sort of NATO bloc in general. And I'll say in sort of popular depiction, the United States tends to be included in the way people conceptualize these things. I saw an image in Western Burkina Faso of three terrorists, like an image sort of depicting terrorism, and the flags covering their faces were France, Ukraine, and the US. And I wanted to actually mention that because you mentioned that in Venezuela, the government arms civilians, and that's something that we could never imagine happening in this sort of intentional, thought out way in the US. Well, the same thing happens in Burkina Faso. We have something called the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, which are fighting against these death squads. But the way Ibrahim Traoré frames it is that they're fighting against colonialism. They're fighting to decolonize the country, because we're fighting for, it's a fight for self-determination. It's a fight to have access to our lands and to, basically chase out what is essentially understood as an imperialist sort of force. And so the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, these are civilians turned combatants. And it's kind of incredible from my standpoint, because even at the Thomas Sankara Centre, there's been people who, we've tried to recruit, we've wanted to bring into our organization, and they'll disappear for a long time. We're like, where did you go? And then they'll pop back up and they're like, actually, I was on the front lines. I decided to become, one of the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. I got my training and I went out and I fought. And these are civilians. These are not career military people.
Soldiers, so, right.
Yeah.
Citizen soldiers.
Citizen soldiers, exactly. Yes.
Which is what democracy is really supposed to be all about. Let's quickly shift here to the first topic from December 9th through the 13th. And folks, we're going to connect some dots here. 240 delegates. They came from 30 nations, 4 continents, and they met in Havana and Matanzas, Cuba, for an international conference, Cuba 2024 Decade for People of African Descent, Equality, Equity, and Social Justice. Inem, talk a bit about this conference that just took place.
Okay, this is a very important and historic conference. I'm sure, as you can imagine, I unfortunately wasn't able to attend the conference, but I was in Cuba with a delegation from the Alliance of Sahel States just 2 weeks before the conference took place. So I actually met a lot of the people who were involved in the conference as we're preparing to get ready, to receive the people coming in from around the world. And I myself, personally, I'll speak for myself, but I can say, other people felt very similarly who came with me. We were just so impressed by the work of the Cuban Revolution to address racism and to honor Africa in such a profound way. I mean, for a lot of the people coming from the Alliance of Sahel States, unfortunately, the reality is people who are traveling from Africa, oftentimes going around the world, are used to going to places where there's just kind of a lot of ignorance around Africa, or we have to challenge stereotypes, and Africa's kind of, denigrated in other countries. And so it was a breath of fresh air to be going places like they have a House of Africa in Havana we visited, and they're talking about how we not only teach African history to all Cubans, not just, it's not just you come, you find this little niche space and you learn about Africa, but something that's embedded into the national curriculum. But they're also doing, for those who want, language courses to learn Swahili and other African languages. We were so impressed by how much people admired Africa on an individual level, but also how the Cuban revolutionary process was honoring Africa. And then we met with somebody, his name is Rolando Julio Mendina Risoli, who is part of this anti-racist programming called Color Cubano. He also runs a house called the Quintin Bandera House. Quintin Bandera was an Afro-Cuban, or all Cubans will actually say they're of African descent. So I'll say he was a Black Cuban who was the head of or general in the war against Spain, so for independence for Cuba. And so they're honoring him, his life and his legacy in his house. But the director also is the head of multiple actually anti-racist programs. And so he was talking to us about, some of the struggle. Racism is much in Cuba because the government has been able to really address much more of the institutional issues. Nowadays, there's not really things we see in the US like, racist type of homicides and shootings and these kinds of things. They don't have those issues in Cuba. So the things that they're addressing are a little bit more on the interpersonal level in terms of perception of people and making sure that they're fighting against discrimination in employment and things. But it's very different than any other place I've been. I think it's so much further along in terms of being able to address these issues. And like I said, it was interesting because all Cubans do have some identity with Africa, regardless of what they look like. Our primary guide, because I was with people from the Alliance of Sahel States, these French-speaking countries, we had a French translator with us. And I guess, we would consider him like a white Cuban, I guess, if we were to meet him in any other context. One of the things he did when he first saw us is he had something that he was drinking. He poured it, in a form of libations on the ground. And that was for the people who were coming from Africa, like, whoa, like in their minds, they're like, this is a white man who's, doing something that's very African to us. And this is like a learning process where it's like, oh, actually, he really actually also identifies a lot with African culture. So, Amilcar Cabral, who was a great Pan-Africanist, talked about as a part of the national liberation struggle over in Guinea-Bissau, he talked about the need to have a process of re-Africanization in terms of how we view ourselves, our participation in the struggle, all of this. I think Cuba that's part of their revolution. It's like this idea that Africa is really at the base of it. And I guess, the final thing I want to say here that is also really important is I met, and we all met as a group, so many people who actually risked their lives to struggle for African liberation while we were in Cuba. We had like scheduled meetings. So we met with somebody named Commander Victor Dreke, who was a big figure, second in command after Ernesto Che Guevara. The Cubans went to Congo to help the supporters of Patrice Lumumba to, retake power after, unfortunately, Belgian and CIA US influences assassinated Lumumba. So we met somebody who was second in command in that struggle, like really at the forefront. We met Ernesto Che Guevara's daughter, who actually, apart from being a huge figure of the Cuban Revolution, was also somebody who lived for a long time in Angola and was serving, the Angolan people as a part of their liberation struggle. And then kind of by accident, we just kept meeting people who had lived in Angola and had like struggled either in the liberation struggle, the war to liberate Angola, or had otherwise served as doctors or, some sort of other like providing social services. We kind of just kept meeting them everywhere we were going. Like even in the streets, we were like stumbling upon people who were like, oh, you're from Africa. I lived in Angola and I was doing this. So it was everywhere. I mean, it was an incredible thing, to see. Yeah, just how strong that relationship is between Cuba and African people, the continent, and the diaspora.
Talk a little bit about the move to have Cuba reclassified off of the U.S. state sponsor of terrorism, because that designation goes a very long way in isolating a country, prohibiting the country from economically engaging, politically engaging with other countries around the world. If my memory is correct, President Obama did not remove Cuba from the list, but was in the process of loosening some of the sanctions and taking some of the pressure off. Donald Trump comes in, reinstitutes those sanctions, even turns the screws on those sanctions. And many thought that Joe Biden would follow along Obama's line, but he didn't. Biden went along the same line as Donald Trump, demonstrating to me that this is not as much administration policy as it is American foreign policy.
Absolutely. I mean, so Obama actually did remove Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list for a period.
Took them off the list.
Yeah, they did. And then they were re-added. But I think it's so important for people to understand, why Cuba was put on that list in the first place. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the United States is not happy about the Cuban Revolution. Some of the, the very first sanctions against Cuba were because Cuba nationalized its major industries and, wanted to control its own economy, which was upsetting. But for the state sponsor of terrorism list in particular, if you look at the very first reasons why Cuba was ever added to that list, it's actually for the reasons I just spoke about, which is the fact that Cuba was supporting liberation struggles in Africa and Latin America. Those liberation struggles, according to that original state sponsor of terrorism classification, were terrorist struggles. So these people fighting against colonialism, saying that they didn't want, European colonialism, or thinking about the Sandinistas in Nicaragua who didn't want like a US-backed dictatorship, those are the so-called terrorists that Cuba was initially punished for supporting. And then if you look now at their classification, it's pretty similar. The sort of the reason why they were reinstated, they said that Cuba was giving support to certain groups in Colombia. The Colombian government has said that, the current Colombian government has said that they disagree entirely with Cuba being placed on this list to protect Colombia, somehow removed Cuba from the list. That's what they've said. And the other thing that's mentioned is also that Cuba has protected certain US political prisoners like Assata Shakur. These are things that are like actually incredible acts of international solidarity and support for Black people, for colonized people, oppressed people all around the world. These are actually the reasons why Cuba is considered a supporter of terrorism, as well as their solidarity with Venezuela, which is another thing that actually, if you look at the U.S. State Department's website, is listed as a reason why they're on this list. So the so-called terrorism that they support is really just like popular global anti-imperialist struggle, liberation struggle. That's why Cuba is considered, a sponsor of terrorism. So I guess in that case, people struggling against imperialism are terrorists, is basically what the United States is stating through this. And if you look at the consequences for Cuba, I mean, it's made things very hard. Even in, to give a personal example of this, it was hard for us to figure out, organizing the delegation to the AES because, even though the Alliance of Sahel States has great relations with Cuba, some of the local banks in West Africa region, we've nationalized some of them in Burkina Faso. And I think hopefully there's a process to nationalize other banks. But some of the banks are not owned locally and don't work with Cuba. And that's something that we encountered. Like a lot of banks around the world, even both within and outside of the US, just won't do anything that will involve getting any sort of money to Cuba. There's a way that there's kind of over-compliance in the way that some of the banks actually do even more than the law requires them, just because they want to be extra careful. And it's like you never know how you're going to be punished for being in solidarity with Cuba, for sending money to Cuba. Sometimes things are a little ambiguous to the point where Cuba is even extra isolated because people want to be extra prudent and just don't do anything with Cuba at all. You can't fundraise for Cuba publicly. You can't. It's hard to send money. One of the Cubans we met talked about how he did live abroad for a period of time. He was working in Europe and he got fired from his job. Basically, he got let go of because the company he was working at basically said, we're really nervous about these sanctions. We got some threat that's like, we have Cubans in our company, and if we continue to pay you, we're going to be in trouble with the U.S. government. So we have to let you go. It's just this constant, there's like fear tactics, paranoia of, what are their punishments going to look like. There's another thing that's also tied to this where, so if you are a U.S. citizen, you can't go to Cuba for tourism, but other countries around the world you can. But there's something now where if you, for example, are an EU citizen, you have a passport that's from the EU. Normally, you could visit Cuba as a tourist, but the United States has said that if you choose to do that, if you're from France, even if you're from a non-EU country, perhaps like the UK, Germany, any of these countries, and you visit Cuba, be prepared to no longer have visa-free access to come to the United States. You no longer can come to the US without a visa. And so now you're going to have to go through a process, and we're going to ask you questions about Cuba and your time there and interrogate you and, shake things up a little bit. Just, all of these are ways to really discourage people from contributing to Cuba's economy and, try as hard as they can to isolate Cuba from the rest of the world. But despite that, I'll say Cuba's doing a really good job. I met people from many countries when I was in Cuba. So, it's a struggle. And I think, people are trying to resist it in any ways they can. It takes creativity, but they really should be removed from this list. Especially because, Cuba's in solidarity with us, around the world, they're in solidarity with people like you and I, and that's why they're on this list to begin with. So I owe it to Cuba, which has basically been punished for helping the rest of the planet. I think now the rest of the planet owes it to Cuba to struggle and be in solidarity with them.
So let's now shift from Cuba to Burkina Faso and the Alliance of Sahel States, because you mentioned that you were part of a Sahel Alliance of Sahel States organization that went to Cuba before this conference. We've been talking about this, but it succinctly explain some of the similarities between what's the basis of this growing alliance between Cuba and the Sahel?
Oh, I think the relationship between Cuba and the Alliance of Sahel States is going to be stronger than ever. I mean, the Alliance of Sahel States, because they don't want to work with countries, that their whole deal has been very clearly, we will work with any country that's willing to respect our sovereignty and our self-determination, but not countries that are going to boss us around, bully us, steal our resources, threaten us, wag their fingers in our faces, etc. And so because of that, the Alliance of Sahel States has de-linked itself from countries like France, from other EU countries, and even from the United States. And it's said it's thought countries, relationships with countries such as Cuba, but also such as Nicaragua and Venezuela, so these ALBA countries, it's their bloc in Latin America, have become very close with the Alliance of Sahel States countries. And as I mentioned, for Burkina Faso in particular, the history between Cuba and Burkina Faso is just so deep. I mean, Thomas Sankara went to Cuba a couple of times, and he was awarded the Jose Marti Award, which was the highest honor that the Cuban Revolution bestowed. Mm-hmm. And Fidel Castro came to Burkina Faso and was given an award called the Gold Star of Nauri, which was Burkina Faso's highest honor that he was given. And Cuba, to this day, they have something called the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. There are many, they're in every single neighborhood. They're actually even within the neighborhoods, there are multiple. It's like there's so many. It's like a mass organization, you know, that hundreds of thousands of members. I actually don't know how many exactly, but they serve kind of, like I mentioned in Burkina, the eyes and ears of the revolution, but they also have done health campaigns, literacy campaigns. Well, in Burkina Faso, under Thomas Sankara, there were committees for the defense of the revolution. They had the same name, and they were inspired by Cuba, and they did much of the same thing, in, you know, protecting the people. They were, the differences in Burkina at the time, these groups were oftentimes armed, versus in Cuba, they're much more strictly a civilian force. And then today, as I mentioned, we have the Citizens Night Watch in Burkina, which is inspired by the Burkina Faso Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, which are inspired by the Cuban Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. So actually, the Thomas Sankara Centre, one of the works we do is trying to facilitate more conversation between the Cuban model, the older Burkina Faso model in the 80s, and then the current model, so they can kind of all exchange and figure out how, you know, they can learn from each other, and how, you know, they can inspire this new generation, and we can adopt some of what worked in the past. The slogan of Burkina Faso is "The homeland or death, we will succeed." In French, it's "La patrie le mort nous vaincrons." In Spanish, it's, you know, it's "Patria o muerte venceremos." That's a direct quote from Fidel Castro. It's in the national anthem of Burkina Faso. This is something people say every single day. It's the national motto of the country. So the Cuban Revolution and the Burkina Faso Revolution are so linked together. It's like so intrinsically tied.
Shelly H says, I made the mistake of logging into my investment account from Cuba using hotel Wi-Fi. I made transactions just to check on my balances for maybe 2 minutes. All of my accounts were frozen. That's just one example of what folks are subjected to, trying to engage in personal business, not trying to overthrow anything, but just trying. That shows the stranglehold that these sanctions can have. And what people really need to understand is, and this is a perfect example, thank you, Shelley, of that this is warfare via economic means. That's the when we look at these sanctions, this is warfare strictly by economic means. So the Alliance of Sahel States, I think it was born in 2023 with the signing of the Liptako-Gorma Charter. You've got Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. All three countries have been in the news very recently, primarily for throwing France out in various forms and functions, throwing the United States out, wanting to manage their own affairs. Because a lot of people would say, well, I thought that there were revolutions. I thought these countries gained their independence. But there's a difference between flag independence, which they had, but then actually controlling your own country, controlling your own economies, controlling the space within the defined borders of the country. And this now is what these countries are struggling to maintain.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to understand a lot of the countries, actually 2 out of 3, I'm speaking of, in this case, Burkina Faso and Mali, have both had, you know, these revolutionary Pan-African governments in the past. But unfortunately, as what happens so often is, you know, there's foreign intervention and leaders get overthrown. Thomas Sankara, for example, got assassinated. Mali had a revolutionary president named Modibo Keita, who was overthrown in a coup d'etat. And the gains of these revolutions were basically wiped out for a period of time. And so people find it so important to protect and defend what's currently happening, and to understand the Pan-African dimension, the fact that these countries are not isolated, but they need to have support from other countries that need to join in to this bloc, you know, have internationalist solidarity across the world from all peoples to protect and defend what's going on. We've talked about the sanctions on Cuba, and they're particularly atrocious sanctions on Cuba. The sanctions on the Alliance of Sahel States countries are really just beginning. There's currently sanctions on Mali, U.S. sanctions on Mali. the European Union is sanctioning both Mali and Niger. And what we're seeing is a lot of media warfare. To give you one example, there's been some reports. One of them that was particularly egregious was put out by Human Rights Watch, which accused Burkina Faso's military of slaughtering civilians. And I'll say, somebody who lives in Burkina, there has been, I'm not saying there's no opposition, but there's not like any sort of struggle to overthrow the Burkina Faso government right now internal to the country. That doesn't really exist in Burkina. Actually, what has happened instead of that is, in response to these sort of media reports accusing Burkina Faso of all these, like, to me would seem like just crazy things, people have actually come out and protested that. So when Human Rights Watch, came out and was like, Burkina Faso's military is slaughtering civilians, the people of Burkina Faso went to the U.S. embassy and they said, we chased the French embassy out. We will chase the U.S. embassy out if you continue to put out these narratives. We know you're behind this. If you spread this sort of propaganda, we just wait and see what happens. And people, it was like hundreds of people stormed, overnight in a matter of minutes to this embassy and protesting these sort of claims. The reason why we see these sorts of media propaganda about these countries is so that they can, with time, convince people that intervention is okay or sanctions are okay. They're working up to a point where they can have enough people being like, oh, I don't agree what's happening in this area. I might not understand the Sahel, but I've read, BBC reports or, I've seen, CNN, and they've said these things. I know it's wrong. And, at that point, they can put on some like serious sanctions like we see in Cuba and Venezuela.
In fact, Daniel Drazenovich, thank you for that super sticker. Is it true that the West is backing religious insurgencies in Burkina Faso? Let me answer that before you do, and then correct me if I'm wrong. The answer is yes. The United States is backing religious insurgencies. And the irony is many of them are what basically ISIS reconstituted. And what we're finding, for example, is a lot of the religious soldiers or mercenaries that were in Syria have now made their way into the Sahel. A lot of the equipment that was in Ukraine, drones and other types of things that were made in Ukraine, used in Ukraine, are now being found on the ground in the Sahel. So what the United States is doing is using ISIS in different formulations. And remember, folks, ISIS is who we're supposed to be against. ISIS is supposed to be our enemy, when in fact, they just change their uniforms, they change their name, they take American training, they take American dollars, and they are serving at the behest of American interests. Inem, your thoughts. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So France and Ukraine have been very publicly accused by the Alliance of Sahel States leaderships of supporting these terrorist organizations, these death squads. And there was also an incident where in Mali, they liberated this this terrorist stronghold, basically, that was controlled by these groups for a long time. The Malian government liberated that area. It's called Kidal. And when they were able to retake it and reclaim it for the Malian people, there was all this evidence left behind of a U.S. mercenary who was bizarrely just happened to be there the whole time, I guess, in this terrorist zone. He left behind certain things that identified him as being, this U.S. citizen mercenary that happened to be there. And operative, thank you so much. So yeah, and that really points to, for a lot of people, that indicates there's some involvement and it's the irony, of course, like you're saying, or the strategy, not even the irony, the strategy has been to use these terrorist organizations as a pretext to occupy the Sahel militarily. So their whole reason why, we're talking about, we kicked out French military, US military, the whole reason they were there in the first place was supposed to be to fight against terrorism. Actually, if you look at the statistics, Burkina Faso never had a terrorist attack prior to 2015. And this year, Burkina Faso is considered the #1 country in the world like World Center of Terrorism for 2023 and most of 2024. I mean, Syria is looking like it unfortunately, there's a situation there that might become similar. But the center of world terrorism has actually been the Sahel more than any other part of the world in these past few years. And like I said, prior to 2015, that was non-existent. So it's a huge question mark and curiosity to people that actually the rise in terrorism has corresponded with the rise of US military and French military occupation in the region. And then the last thing I'll say about here is, even though these groups claim to be religious, or,
Right.
for most people in the Sahel, we understand like this is not a religious thing. Like, there's Muslims, there's Christians, there's people who practice traditional religions, but these people have like nothing to do with any of them. We don't believe they even believe in the religion that they claim to be supporting. It's really been like a guise, but there's no sort of actual religious motivation in terms of what they're doing.
In fact, connecting dots here, Haiti has endured decades of political and economic destabilization, challenging colonial powers. If the Sahel nations continue to defy Western interference, we're looking at a future where these nations suffer the same, or are we? This is the question. Are we looking at a situation where these nations will suffer the same fate as Haiti?
Well, I would say that if you look at what's happening in Haiti right now, it's already very similar to what the Sahel has been experiencing. In the Sahel, we call them terrorists. In Haiti, they call them gangs. But if you actually look at what's going on with the terrorists and the gangs, it's almost identical. I mean, there's been a lot of proof that the gangs in Haiti seem to be receiving like shipments of weapons coming in from the United States mysteriously. Like, oh, the weapons keep coming in from the US, getting into Haiti and landing in the hands of these gangs. Well, that to me at least seems to indicate that there's some sort of backing from the US in support of these gangs. And at the same time, the gangs in Haiti are used as an excuse, as a pretext to say, we need to invade Haiti, occupy Haiti militarily. That's exactly what's happened in the Sahel for so long now. So the strategies actually just find that also very, very similar. Now, will the AES be punished in the way that the Haitian Revolution was punished? I think, I think it depends on, I don't want to sound cliche, but it does kind of depend on us, not just you and I as individuals, but I think it depends on us in terms of, regular people around the world who care about these issues as to whether or not the AES is punished like Haiti or not. There needs to be international solidarity for the Alliance of Sahel States. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of information that the average person gets, especially, I'd say in English-speaking countries in general, but then maybe especially in like US, Canada. If you walk around on the street and you ask people about, what's happening in Burkina Faso, I think the vast majority of people just wouldn't know. And so I think it's so important that we have an international movement that's very clear about, we need to support the people's struggle in the Sahel. It's not just about the leaders. We appreciate the leaders, so we don't want to fall for propaganda against them. But, it's about the people's movements. It's about the fact that the people's demands are being taken up by these leaders. And we need to be able to spread what's happening, to share that, to diffuse that, to organize workshops, to share resources, so that we don't see this long, many like decades or centuries of just brutal repression and backlash against the fact that the people have risen up. So I think a lot of it does depend on internationalism and this sort of solidarity and building a movement.
Talk about I wrote a piece a while ago, the dangers of minstrel diplomacy in the United States. And I was pointing out the fact that you have Black faces that are being used in various aspects to champion this imperialist policy. You've got General Michael Langley, the head of AFRICOM. You've got Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. UN ambassador to the UN. You've got the Secretary of State, Lloyd Austin, who went to Kenya to pay William Ruto the money to back the United States reinvasion of Haiti. Vice President Kamala Harris went to CARICOM to convince CARICOM to back the U.S. play to recolonize Haiti. The House Minority Leader, whose name is escaping me at the moment. these are just examples of black faces. Some would even tell you that that was Barack Obama's primary job, was to be the black face on promoting American neo-colonialism and imperialism. Your thoughts?
That's a
Hakeem Jeffries. Thank you, Charles Irby. Hakeem Jeffries went with Kamala Harris to CARICOM to twist their arms to back the U.S. play.
This is a huge strategy on the part of the U.S., and they've been using it for a little while now. Certainly over the past maybe decade or so, they've realized that could be a really effective strategy. I think Obama is a good example because the U.S. military expanded its presence in Africa under Obama more than under any other U.S. president in history. So he was really the forefront of this sort of expansion. And, that was able to happen because people were really hopeful. We have, this black face in a high space, and, this is going to be great. And so even to this day in Africa, unfortunately, there's still places that are named after him. Like there's Obama beaches in various countries in Africa that I've been to, even though a lot of the, current military occupation in many parts of the country was something that he oversaw. And in the destabilization of Libya, which is another, African country that happened during the Obama era. Mm-hmm. And that's when terrorism really took off in a big way in the Sahel because, a lot of when the Libyan government was overthrown, a lot of people were able to access certain weapons and weapons coming from Libya and bring those into other parts of Africa, especially Mali, and then after that Burkina Faso, Niger, and elsewhere to start some of these terrorist attacks. So it's been a very huge strategy. I think it worked in Burkina Faso for a little while. I forget his name, but at one point the U.S. ambassador to Burkina Faso was a black man, and people, I remember very explicitly were telling me, like, we love him. We're happy to see like a black man coming Africa. We love him. He's so nice. And he even wears like the traditional clothes. And he seems to be friendly and laugh and make jokes. So there's they choose, in this case, somebody who's charismatic, who's willing to, blend in with the people, who shows an interest in their culture. But, eventually people caught on that, well, what about the policies though? Is he like smiling and, he's engaging in cultural activities on Monday, and then on Tuesday he's like, we're gonna expand our military presence, we're gonna figure out how to get more resources from Burkina to the US. People have begun to catch on a little bit, which is why AFRICOM was expelled from Niger. Niger is the first African country in history to expel AFRICOM. People have been able to realize, okay, it's not just about what people look like or sort of their identity, but it's also about whose interests do they represent. And I think part of what helps people understand this in that region is the fact that we also have unfortunately so many African leaders who are also Black people who look like us, who talk like us, who culturally are relatable to us, who also unfortunately represent, U.S. or French interests. So we've been able to kind of realize, okay, well, if an African president in Ivory Coast can look like us and talk like us and still sell us out, then, it could happen from also somebody that the United States sends, to represent them. So people have kind of matured politically, but this is a big strategy. And there's definitely a reason why the U.S. keeps doing this time and time again.
Is the Sahel becoming the new Ukraine? And what I mean by that is, many people may not realize, the Ukraine was really the United States proxy to engage militarily against Russia. Now that the Ukraine is lost, and folks, I know the fighting continues, but the game's over. The war is lost, even though they continue to try to send missiles and all that. That's done. It seems as though the focus now has shifted from Ukraine to the Sahel, and Ukraine is involved. And what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of the United States ire has to do with Russian involvement in the Sahel and the Chinese involvement in the Sahel. And that's not military involvement for the most part. It's economic development. For example, I read a story about 2-3 months ago that there's now been a agreement between Burkina Faso and Russia to launch satellites from Burkina Faso. Well, That's a whole lot more involved than just launching satellites. That's technology transfer. That's infrastructure development. There's a lot of things that have to take place in order for satellites to get launched. And oh, by the way, when the satellites get launched, whose interests are those satellites going to serve? So that's just an example of what I see as being the imperialist colonial fear of the West against development led by Russia, led by China. There's a whole lot in there, but I know, Inem, you can handle it.
No, it's a great point. I mean, this is definitely one of the biggest reasons why the West has kind of been wagging its finger in the front of the faces of the Alliance of Sahel states. And actually, the reason why Mali is being sanctioned by the United States right now is because Mali has chosen Russia as a partner, as has Burkina Faso and Niger, which is I guess, from the perspective of sort of mainstream U.S., the scope of U.S. two-party politics is supposed to be shocking, and that's beyond comprehension. But on the ground there, it makes a lot of sense. Russia is serving as a partner for the Sahel that is allowing for these countries to embark on an actual process of industrialization. One of the things I hear all the time is people saying, well, Russia's doing it for their own interests. Russia's just looking out for itself, and they want access to, African resources. And that very well may be the case, and I think in a context of geopolitics, it's fairly normal. Every country is supposed to benefit from any sort of agreement. So, I'm sure Russia does look forward to gaining something in this agreement as well. But the difference is, the West used to take African resources. And as a result, I guess the trade-off would be that the West would occupy the region militarily, and the terrorism problem would actually get worse and worse. Versus with Russia, what we're seeing is, in exchange for some resources in the short term, we're going to be able to have these partnerships where we're building things like, for example, energy facilities, where there's a nuclear power plant. Mali is building West Africa's largest solar panel field. There are factories, refineries. All of this is a process of industrialization, which will allow for these African countries to actually become more independent in the long term. If in the short term, we have to give some resources so that in the long term, we can actually develop and transform those resources here on the ground, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, short term, we don't have the capacity, actually, unfortunately, to tomorrow, just say we're refining all of the gold and the uranium in the region here. We don't have those facilities. But if we can use, partnership with Russia to build them, then sure, Russia can have those resources for now. And then once those things are in place, we can transform those resources here and actually, not be reliant on other countries and need to export everything, in its raw form, which has kind of been the basis of how Africa has been colonized for so long now, or neo-colonized. And there's, of course, a lot of Russia boogeyman, and we're upset with Russia. Ukraine got involved, as you mentioned. Ukraine has seen what's been going on and took that as an occasion to jump in and basically say that we support the terrorists. If you're working with Russia, then we support the terrorists against you, which is just absurd to imagine that they'd even be bold enough to come out and say something like that. But two officials from Ukraine did. So we are seeing that kind of dynamic, like what you're saying.
In fact, there are a couple of elements here to boil it down to some of its most simplistic elements. The West is imperialist. Russia is anti-imperialist. That's some of the fundamental in terms of an ideological aspect of this. And how do I know that Russia is anti-imperialist? Look at the support that Russia has given to African countries struggling for independence. Angola is an example of that. Where is Patrice Lumumba University? It's in Moscow.
Absolutely.
So what you're looking at in the simplest forms is, people, well, why is the United States so hell-bent on stifling Russia? Imperialism versus anti-imperialism. And another element of this, going back to Muammar Gaddafi, one of Gaddafi's famous quotes was always, Africa for the Africans. And you mentioned building the largest solar panel field. That's just an example of Africa for the Africans. And one of the other things, I'm glad you made the point about processing raw materials. One of the things that the colonial powers have been very successful at is extracting the raw materials from Africa, from African countries, not allowing those countries to process those materials in-house and then sell the finished product on the world market. They extract the raw material, they extract the ore, they extract the cocoa, they extract the aluminum, they extract the titanium, pay pennies on the dollar for the raw material, finish the raw material outside the country, sell the final product on the world market at exponentially inflated prices. Why can't the African countries that possess the materials profit from their own resources? Inem.
I love hearing this. I mean, this is a breath of fresh air for me because I feel like, it might be a little harder to find this kind of perspective in the United States. I mean, it's definitely not something you turn on the TV and you ever hear. And so sometimes it's kind of hard, like, to find people in the US who do understand this very well. But what you just said, this is exactly how the vast majority of people in the Alliance of Sahel states feel. And perhaps, more broadly in the global South, there's a trend of more people having this kind of analysis that you just shared. I mean, if we think about it, the world has been so dominated for a very long time just by like a very small corner of the world. It's been Western Europe and then like the US and Canada, which identify very strongly with, Western Europe, and they're together in this NATO bloc. And they've kind of, controlled the show and run the shots. And there's been this long history of overthrowing, whether rigging elections, coups, assassinating, any leaders that go against them that they don't agree with, whether in Latin America, Africa, Asia, other parts of the world. And people are seeing now that there's other countries now that are coming up and they're kind of challenging this. And there's some opening now. There is Russia, there is China, there's other countries that, you mentioned Venezuela, Cuba. These are other countries now that are there that are able to kind of push back a little bit. And the Alliance of Sahel States really does see itself as part of this new emerging, more like anti-imperialist world bloc that is confronting this sort of Western and US control of the world for so long. And there's a term that's very popular in the Sahel called multipolarity. This idea that, there's been like one pole that's controlled the world for so long. It's been this, US, Western or NATO pole that's run the show. In Burkina Faso, it's especially been like the US and France that have controlled, all the decisions. And if anybody stands up to them, like we saw with Thomas Sankara, unfortunately, this person will get killed or otherwise overthrown. But we're seeing now that we do have powerful countries like Russia and like China that we can work with. And, here's what I'll say. A lot of people are like, oh, well, isn't Russia also a colonizer? Aren't they also imperialists? But they've never, as far as I know, I've never heard a history of Russia overthrowing an African leader they didn't like, assassinating an African leader that disagreed with them, rigging an election, this kind of stuff. There's no historical precedent for it, unlike with the US or France or other European countries. And so people are excited that, maybe with the rise of these other powers like Russia and China, there might be some space for African countries to finally begin to develop and, create some sort of power within their own continent and develop their resources, transform them, and then also one day, be able to have some of the power that exists in the world stage in a more diffused way.
All right, final question for you, and thank you. You've been so gracious with your time. It's early in the morning for you, and I greatly appreciate you giving me this time. When you look at the rise of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and there are other countries that have joined. To my knowledge, South Africa currently is the only African country in BRICS. Do you see members of the Sahel, of the Alliance of Sahel States, and other countries in the Sahel joining BRICS in the near future?
So there were a couple African countries that joined recently, though they haven't changed the name. So I know like Ethiopia and Egypt recently joined. Burkina Faso and Mali have both expressed an interest in wanting to join BRICS. They've requested membership into the bloc. So hopefully, the next time around, I think they do it like every time there's a BRICS summit. At least the last couple of times there have been BRICS summits. They've either allowed more countries to join BRICS directly or become BRICS partners. Right. So we're all hoping that the next time there's a summit, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger will be considered, for membership. I think the way it works now is you're a partner for a period of time and then you become a member. But the countries have been very clear they would like to be part of it. And so I think,
as says Ethiopia, Uganda, and Cuba are all in BRICS. And there are different elements of membership. There's partnership versus membership. So Uzbekistan and 6 others recently joined. But again, it can be a matter of membership versus partnership. And I don't say that as to push back. But there are various elements of participation. Let's put it that way.
Yes, and long story short, that the answer is yes. This is something that the Alliance of Sahel States is seeking, and we're hoping it's something that BRICS is also open to.
Wow. Inem Richardson, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that. And I truly, truly, truly look forward to having you back.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I encourage people, if they're on Instagram, to check out our work. It's Burkina Books. And, we are always looking for ways to support the Alliance of Sahel States. So if you're interested in ways that you can, also contribute and send your support, check out our social media. We are actually fundraising to bring more books into the Alliance of Sahel States. So if you're interested in that, you can check out tinyurl.com/SahelBooks or tinyurl.com/Niger Library, or you can check out our Patreon, which is patreon.com/Burkina Books. I really appreciate being able to share, and I think it's just so important to have these conversations and these exchanges.
Inem Richardson, thank you. Great. Appreciate the work. And again, look forward to having you back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, I want to thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episodes every day. Please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. You can find all the links below in the show description. And folks, remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you all tomorrow. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a beautiful, blessed day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.